community and arts.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Molly Smiltneek. Tonight, we are going to talk about asylum and the Afghan asylum situation and, well, the Afghan situation and how asylum plays into that. And then also kind of talking through ideas, as many of you are working with immigrants that have different issues, maybe are asylum seekers, and kind of, or obviously are English language learners, and kind of talking through, how our immigration system maybe might not be working the best for most of our immigrants coming into our country, opportunities for reform and opportunities to better serve the people that we are already serving in so many different ways. So most of tonight we'll be talking about asylum though, but just a little bit about me. I have been an immigration attorney for quite some time. Not always, I mean, I didn't realize that that's gonna be on there too, so that's gonna be fun. But my history is that I went to Madison and then I went to Marquette Law, and at Marquette, they have a great, well, they have great internships period, but I got to be very involved with Catholic Charities of Milwaukee. And they are one of the best low-income nonprofit immigration service providers nationwide, but in Wisconsin, they are one of the best immigration providers, period. And so I was very lucky to get to know them, and I've maintained a relationship with them for a very long time. Since then, I've also done corporate immigration. I also went back and worked at Catholic Charities for a while. Then I actually technically wasn't working, but I always kept my law license. And in that time, I was mostly, I guess I was a stay-at-home legal advocate is what I made up as my term for a while. I did a lot of advocacy work, mostly with the Latino community in our area. And with I was involved with DACA for initial applications. And as kind of politics changes, often with know your rights, and then also doing things like this, educating the larger community about challenges facing the immigrant population. And I do lots of other things. And then I got an email this spring from World Relief where they said, hey, what do you think about asylum? Because guess what, we need to apply for asylum for a bunch of people, because you may have all heard of the stuff in the news with the Afghans coming. And this was a very new situation for World Relief. They usually work with a group of immigrants that are very close to what we'll talk about with asylees, but refugees already have this status. They've already established all of this and come in with a very clear path of how they can stay in our country legally and have a future here. The difference with the Afghans is they do not have that. And the difference with many of the people that you work with in various ways is that they do not have that path. But we also are hearing a lot about asylum in the news right now. But so I was very lucky where I felt like I was the right person in the right place at the right time to be able to come in and work with World Relief to serve this client population that is in desperate need of some assistance. So tonight, though, we kind of have 4 goals. I'm going to talk through U.S. asylum system. I'm not going to go all the way into the immigration system. I can do immigration 101, but that would go a little crazy. And then we're going to talk about the Afghan asylum situation and the Afghan situation, period, about how it is exacerbating some pretty major problems already existing in our immigration rules. And then we're going to talk a little bit about opportunities for reform and ways that we can, like I said, better meet the needs of the immigrants that are here in our country, and whether or not that's directly related to asylum or not. We'll talk specifically about the Afghan Adjustment Act and what impact that would have on asylum, but then also kind of talk through, like, are there better ways that we could be helping the people who are applying for asylum right now in the country? So I want to start off, I should say too, feel free to ask questions as we go through this. We'll off with time at the end, and I should make sure I realize that there's time at the end, but ask questions as we're going, because there's going to be a lot of stuff we talk through. So, but here's where we first have to answer a question. What comes to your mind when you think of asylum? What have you heard about in the news? What have you experienced with clients? What have you seen? Any ideas? Anyone?
Like from somewhere else.
Okay, like from somewhere else. Yes, that's great. Do people think of a particular reason for flight, or like what is, it's flight, it's like kind of often pushing people away. Are you thinking of any specific reasons that people would come here and apply for asylum, or from areas of the world that they might be coming from?
Their life has to be pretty catastrophic for them to get up and go. I mean, they're not coming just because they want to leave their family and everything they own, right? They're desperate.
Yes, there's a lot of desperation, and there's a lot of desperation, I would argue, in many immigration situations. And what we'll discover tonight is that may or may not qualify them for asylum just because they are desperate. It's the frustration of the system. But any other thoughts about it? Because like, so for me, I remember when I was first, I took a whole law school class. For me, I remember my first thought from asylum were, you hear about in the news like 10 or 15 years ago, especially, you hear about like, let's say, female genital mutilation coming out of Africa, things that were so atrociously different than what happens in our country. And it's often, like done by the whole country is perpetrating things against groups of people. And some of that is true, and some of that, I would argue that asylum really encompasses a lot more than that. But do keep in mind, maybe as we're talking through this, what your stereotypes are, good or bad, about asylum seekers, and how your thoughts on who we should be helping may or may not be reflected in what the law actually allows for. But so here's where we go into my legal stuff. So this is where I was talking, I mentioned earlier that many of world relief clients generally are very similar to asylees. Asylees must meet the definition of refugee, which means there's past persecution, and persecution is harm perpetrated by the government or a group that the government cannot control or chooses not to control. So it's persecution. And persecution is something more than just harassment or even just getting hurt about something. It's a higher standard than that. But so it's by the government or a group that they cannot or will not control. That comes into play a lot if you think about what's happening in geopolitics. And then the persecution, though, is harm, this flight, the reason something that's causing the flight, it must be on account of at least one of 5 categories. And then kind of the caveat, which we always have in everything with immigration, is and you must not be barred for other reasons from coming into the country. And that's generally a good thing that we have these protections in that. Sometimes it is a pain in the butt, though, as I will explain. But so just again to remind you, so when we hear about refugees coming into our country, like World Relief has settled over 1,000 refugees to our greater Fox Valley area. They have already been determined to fit these categories while they are abroad, while they're in different camps. And then there's kind of a whole, James can tell you much more about this than I can. There's a whole international organization and process that determines where people get sent and how they end up here in Fox Valley or anywhere else. And I also will mention now that refugees often tend to be from a different part of the world than many of our asylum seekers are from, just in general, but not completely. So what are those protected grounds? These are the grounds that our government and international law has determined to be so important to a person's to their being that they should not be required to change them. So that's race, religion, nationality or ethnicity, that means different things in different parts of the world, political opinion, and then the catch-all for asylum is membership in a particular social group. So a particular social group in my Afghanistan situation could be that you were people who worked with the US government when we were very active in Afghanistan. In Central America, it could be you are a person who refuses to join a gang. It could be that you, as my example, I talked about female genital mutilation, you do not want to participate in your traditions, ceremonies, and that would also fall then also into potentially into religion. But so these categories kind of can cross over. But so that harm, that flight, must be at least partially based on one of these things for you to be able to obtain asylum. Are there any ideas? So there's some things that cause people to flee their country that are not in this category. Any thoughts on what that is? What some of those might be? Poverty. Yeah, that's one. You got the one that I want to right away. Lack of opportunity is not a protected ground. Lack of jobs, just having no money, looking for a better future for your family, in and of itself is not a grounds for asylum. You might be able to find other grounds in there, but so that is often one of the reasons that people flee their home. No, not in and of itself. There are some other protections for that. And it's I sort of being creative in my mind. You could say, oh, well, you could maybe fit into a particular social group or an ethnicity if you were, if the government chooses not to help people of a certain ethnicity as equally as it would like after an earthquake, say in Iran or somewhere. We do have other temporary protections for earthquakes and civil war. Civil war is not automatically protected here. So just generalized violence in your country is not enough for you to get asylum or refugee status. So how the heck do you figure this out? In general, this is, and again, our refugees go through this process outside of the country, and people seeking asylum go through it here. If you have any kind of legal assistance, a lawyer like me or an advocate helping you, this one involves long, intense personal interviews where we are asking you over and over and over again about the worst things that have ever happened to you in your life. And you have to share it with me because you'll be asked about it at your asylum hearing. Or if you ask for asylum at the border and have to go through, which is something that's more and more common, you will have to kind of justify pretty quickly to some people who are somewhat adversarial to you why you should be able to justify staying here in the country under these grounds. And so you have to gather a lot of evidence. It's both subjective and objective, meaning the person believes that they are persecuted or will be persecuted in the future. And objectively, whether it's the United States or the UN or Human Rights Watch and other organizations or just news articles say, oh yeah, this group of Venezuelans who don't agree with the government or have a political opinion against the current, more socialist or communist government, they are being persecuted. That's how you prove up asylum on a given case. So obviously asylum is a great thing. And just like any other general immigration that's a permanent immigration in the United States, it leads you to a good path. If you're granted, well, as soon as you file for asylum, you actually can get work authorization here in the United States. You have an unrestricted Social Security card because they think you'll eventually get that green card. And you get federal eligibility for federal benefits. And most importantly, though, once you have asylum, after 1 year, you can apply for your green card, and you have to apply for your green card eventually to stay here permanently. And that is this part of the process. Once you have asylum, is the same as if you were come into the country as a refugee. After 1 year in the country, World Relief helps their clients apply for a green card, and then 5 years after that, they are eligible to apply for citizenship. So that is an amazing, incredible path for those who are lucky enough to be on it. And when I say lucky enough, I automatically cringe because this is humanitarian. We're helping the people who are the most desperate of the desperate, and I don't feel that somebody should be lucky enough to have this help for them. Now these bars to asylum, I want to mention because all asylum is much more political than anybody would like, but there's some things here that really cause some troubles and are also obviously good things. So the major bars are that if you are a danger to U.S. security, so if you yourself are a terrorist, you should not be coming in. Great, that's fine. Or if you've been convicted of a particularly serious crime here in the United States, or a serious non-political crime somewhere else. The reason those are two different terms is because obviously someone who's persecuted by their government likely would be arrested or could be arrested on various other grounds in the past in their home country. So that wouldn't automatically knock them out, but it could. You yourself can't be a persecutor, and you can't have supported terrorism in any way. Those all sound great, except for the fact that the persecutor and the terrorism bars really cause a heck of a lot of trouble for a lot of people who come from war-torn countries, who were either forced to join people who were doing the persecution, or with our Afghans, for example, they were working with the United States, doing things that the U.S. supported them doing, but they were engaging in what, if some people would look at the law, was persecution of the Taliban. So the fact that they were supporting the United States and we've now brought them here might prevent some Afghans from getting asylum. The Afghan situation is slightly different because the government conveniently is saying, oh, we'll forgive that. But if you happen to be in that situation in El Salvador or Guatemala, where there's been civil war on and off for a very long time, you could have that bar. And if you have any kind of support of terrorism, you could be barred as well. And that includes paying off bribes. So it could, or if a gang really kind of controls the power into your small village, literally like the electricity into your village, and you have to pay them so that you can keep the lights on in your family's home, that's material support terrorism by the reading of the law. So really the people who are victims of terrorism are often also under our laws are often barred from asylum themselves. Also coming into play, especially for our Latin American friends, is the safe third country. Basically, if you've gone through another country on the way to the United States and could avail yourself of asylum in that country and it was safe for you to stay there, you are barred from getting asylum in the United States generally. President Trump explicitly went into some of these agreements, which is part of the crisis that's happening on our southern border. But it's a frustrating thing for just about anybody. And we have to actually, no matter where people are coming from, I have to always ask, well, did you settle somewhere else? Could you have stayed there legally? And that might prevent them from getting asylum here. There are a couple other requirements to, like, you have to file within 1 year of getting to the US in general. There's exceptions to that. And the exceptions are really, if you have other immigration status, you can file longer, which is going to help our Afghans. Or if the situation in your country changed. When you left, it was safe. You didn't need to apply for asylum. Then a coup happens and the government that you worked for now is no longer in power. You might be able to apply for asylum so that you can stay here because you have the fear of future persecution if you have to go back. It's also counts against you if you filed for asylum before, because I think people are using the system. And that it doesn't come up that often, but especially I think that's possibly in place because of the fact that many of our people who are coming by land, you know, try to come in often and will keep trying to come in. So this is kind of a barrier for it. But if changed country conditions have occurred, then you're fine. Because again, there's a new claim essentially at that point. So under our normal asylum process, there are currently 470,000 plus affirmative asylum cases pending. And there are about 600,000 defensive applications pending. Affirmative means that within a year, you affirmatively have decided you got here into the country, you're not in removal or deportation proceedings, and you said, I need to apply for asylum. It's an affirmative case and it's a little bit more friendly. That's what I'm helping all the Afghans do. The defensive or expedited process is where you have been arrested to say you want to remove you from the country. This could either happen at the border, which is what we're hearing a lot about in the news right now. It could also happen that, you know, you're picked up in an ICE raid or an ICE pickup, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You've been here for 20 years and something happens that you get put into removal proceedings. Asylum is a defense to stop you from being removed from the country, whether you've been here a long time or a short period of time. But so that's over 1 million cases are pending in our asylum system. And most of these people, it's very hard, there's very few exceptions for our normal asylum system to be outside of that 1 year grounds. So you file, whether it's the affirmative or defensive, you're likely to get an interview in 4 to 6 years. So I know a bunch of immigration attorneys who are sort of near retirement, but not that near retirement, but they can't take new asylum cases because it's going to take 6 years. Like, and they just, it's just so, and that's the beginning of the process. You're not going to be able to do this. And I knew that, I'm going to put it on here. But this is the number of asylum grants, the affirmative and defensive. You'll notice that there are more defensive applications. So people are using it as a protection instead of affirmatively doing it more. But those are also more highly denied, but we'll talk about that later. So our last regular year of numbers prior to the pandemic is 2019. There were 46,000 grants of asylum, which is great. That is a terrific number. And most of the vast So 27,000 were those affirmative cases and 18,000 were those defensive. I just showed this number to say, hey, yeah, and it changes from year to year. This goes back all the way to 1990. And if you can look at lower years period, this is just pure numbers that it changes. But there are lots of components as to what causes those changes and what all goes on. And representation, and in this case, I mean representation with a lawyer or some other advocate, and how your relief is sought matters. That's when I'm talking about affirmatively versus defensively. So here is basically the different ways. If you are, it's a defensive case not represented, you basically have an over 80% chance that your case is going to get denied. If you, on the other hand, if you're affirmatively asking for asylum and you have a lawyer, you only have just about a 30% chance your case is going to be denied. So 70% chance that it's going to get approved. But so representation matters. So the lawyer, having someone help you matters. Then what was the other? And how relief is sought. I want to make sure I just point out that there's automatically, whether it's by law or not, there's a presumption against people getting asylum if it's a defensive case. It's just how it is, that they know that people are grasping at straws, and it might be true that they are not justifiable cases, but it's a significant difference if you are going through the court system to try to get relief. And as with everything in immigration, especially with asylum, politics and the political will of whoever's in power, as well as where you come from as an asylum seeker matter. They very much are tied into each other. So this chart kind of tells some interesting things. The number of people granted asylum will change depending on who's president, because immigration is a very much so an administrative law case where the president and the administrative offices have a lot of discretion. They could basically kill the whole system, or they can say, hey, we're going to grant more asylum. We think that many people qualify for it. So this shows that from Trump to Biden, there has been a lot of change that is still is not that great. Personally, I don't think, but so basically under Trump, your chance of getting denied was 71%. Overall, under Biden, it decreased to 63% chance of being denied overall. So basically right now under Biden, I guess we would argue that you have about a 37% chance, all comers for asylum, of getting asylum if you apply for it. And so some people will get other forms of relief, like the Convention Against Torture. A few people get that instead, but it varies a lot, and it's never good. Your chance, I never want people to have their first choice to be asylum, because these numbers really have not changed for 20+ years. It's very hard to get asylum. What does change though is who gets asylum. This is basically, these next slides are all a little bit of snapshots of different ways of looking at the countries where people are of origin and their likelihood of success. On this one, when people are, this is versus affirmative versus people who are never detained, at least defensive cases. Ethiopia had the highest percentage rating of getting people approved, and Haiti had the lowest percentage rating. Part of the reason Haiti has such problems is when you start asking about natural disasters, it's really hard for the United States government to be like, what causes people to flee from Haiti? Except everything. That it could be they have zero economic structure. They have their political system is obviously a mess, but then they also have so many natural disasters. So it actually makes it a very hard case to get asylum from Haiti, because their government isn't a strong factor, and just a lack of government doesn't actually qualify you often. And then if you look at a different kind of snapshot, you're much more like, so this is people who are in immigration court, countries that we often think of as not necessarily our best allies, are much more likely to get immigration or to get asylum approved, whereas countries from our hemisphere are not. And this it's just it does change regularly. And this is an example of that. So since President Biden has been in office, this is a percent change of how many more people are getting asylum from those countries than they did in the past. So like right now, this is still low rates, but more and more people from these countries are receiving asylum. And we're hearing a ton about Venezuela in the news right now. But these Central American countries, I know we have a lot of asylum or a lot of people here in the United States and in our area from those countries. And I would argue that it is almost impossible to, even though they are, if they were in any other part of the world, I think they would qualify very much for asylum. But because it's our sphere of influence, we don't like to admit that the governments that we're supporting don't have control of the country. And so if you're coming from a country that is an ally of the United States, it's going to be much harder for you to get asylum or refugee status. And that's just why politics matter for all this, and nationality does. So that's the general outlook on asylum. It's not very rosy. Yeah.
Question. So on the principle of non-refoulement,
Yeah.
do U.S. immigration honor that? And if they do, what does that look like?
Of non-what? I don't even know the reference to all
Non-refoulement?
So basically not sending people back to harm.
Yeah. Is that something that we even consider?
Oh, yeah, only not for these asylum cases. You don't so the US won't admit that the places that we're sending a lot of these people back to are harmful. That's particularly for Central America. For every individual country and if every individual case even, they can say, we are not going to initiate removal proceedings against you, or we're not going to act on that, even though we know you're removable. We'll exercise our discretion. That is far more likely to happen, say, for someone from China or from Myanmar or places that depending on, well, some of these countries haven't changed at all over the years, but we send people back to places, especially in Latin America, on the regular. And if nothing else, we also just send them back to Mexico, which is causing its own little issue. But there are some countries, including Afghanistan, where we have been told that we will not, that even if a person is denied asylum, they will not be sent back. That is a rare case for asylum. Yeah. But what if they have refugee status, that changes it a little bit too. So the Afghan situation, so this all, our part of the story started on August 15th when Kabul fell. You know, we heard a little bit in the news about that the United States was pulling out. I mean, it's been in the news on and off for years, was pulling out of Afghanistan. And in doing so, we thought that this would kind of be like I think we thought it would be a peaceful transition, and that perhaps there'd be a coalition government that with kind of competing forces of the government that the United States had supported with not only troops there, but with so much money and so many non-governmental agencies. We thought that they would kind of work together somehow with the Taliban, who obviously they don't have that much in common with. But what really happened is the Taliban quickly took over the whole country, and the government that had been supported by the United States literally just collapsed on itself. Just didn't have anything in place to take care of it. And so the United States really scrambled. And this is a situation of from the time that we first got involved in Afghanistan for 2001 until President various administrations totally dropped the ball and fumbled it. And starting on approximately August 15th, we started doing these evacuation flights out of Kabul. And at least one of our evacuees is on this plane. This is the first one that had 678 people on the 747. But so we evacuated 76,000 people to the United States. They also were hundreds of thousands of people throughout the world, throughout mostly where our Western allies were. So we admitted them to the United States as parolees, and that's humanitarian parole. Basically, there's kind of these broad categories that say, you don't quite fit into any of our immigration categories, but we will do the right thing. And we believe it's a humanitarian thing to do, that will let you come into our country and stay for a certain period of time. Then after that, maybe we'll have something else in place for you, maybe we won't. So they came in, and here in the Fox Valley, and I don't think that this is there, I don't remember anymore, because I think there was another family, but I might be wrong. But it was 181-ish evacuees have been resettled to our greater Fox Valley area from Afghanistan in the last year. And of that, I will start to say that statewide, there's 850 to 900. So our area really got a big number of it, which I find pretty exciting and cool that we get to help out with that many people. But it also shows that our community is kind of welcoming, which is pretty good to be proud of. And I think that we should all recognize that. So when they came in though, they were called evacuees or parolees. They are not refugees in and of themselves. They did not go through the normal process that World Relief usually receives its refugees as. So they had to look for other solutions. Many of them qualified for SIV, which is a special immigrant visa, that because they worked closely with the United States for at least a year. About half of our people here in the Fox Valley are in that situation. Well, it's here and nationwide, are in that situation. That is a whole nother mess. And many are not going to get approved in time before that humanitarian parole ends for them. Then the other option, really, the only other option for these people right now is to apply for asylum, which sort of makes sense, sort of doesn't. I will keep making more and more arguments about why it doesn't make sense. But so there are some ideas of, yeah, these people fear persecution. But we also already kind of have established that they fear persecution because we evacuated them. So perhaps asylum, that whole process is not, we don't need them to prove this at this point. So those are the two permanent options for our Afghans. The third is this thing called temporary protected status. We brought this up and you and I were talking a little bit about whether or not disasters count as, natural disasters count as for asylum. They do not, but the United States uses this little process called temporary protected status a lot for countries that have had natural disasters, countries that are experiencing civil war, countries that, Haiti has temporary protected status, so that's a great thing. It is not a permanent status though. Afghanistan has temporary protected status right now. Ukraine has temporary protected status. Most of Central America does. Chad does, I believe. Like there's a lot of random countries. Problem with temporary protected status is in its name. It's temporary. It doesn't give you any path to any kind of permanent staying in the United States, and it could change at any time. And it did change. Trump, when he was president, terminated a bunch of the temporary protected statuses. But they were all put on hold through the courts. So most of them remain. But when it was created, it was meant to be temporary. It was meant for when there was just something, a blip going on and thinking that people could go home. Now think back to what I told you about how there's 1 million people in the pipeline for for asylum. Here's where we are here. We believe that there are going to be 35 to 50,000 asylees from Afghanistan who need to apply for evacuees who need to apply for asylum in the next year. And that's going to be, this is going to be more than 50 cases. We know of at least 50 cases right now in the Fox Valley. But that's going to go up again because some of the other processes are falling through. These cases, again, because they need to do these intensive interviews, take a lot of time, take a lot of work, period. And they don't have to file for that 1 year, even though many of them wish we had. We're going to miss that deadline because they have an extra year because they're on humanitarian parole. Like all other all other asylum cases for our area, they have to go down to an interview in Chicago. That is normally between 2 and 6 hours long, and it's in downtown Chicago. But that will occur within 45 days of filing. Did you remember what I said for the timeline for the other ones? For 4 to 6 years. And then they'll get a decision within 150 days after we file. So the United States put some things in place to try to give preferential treatment to the Afghans, for better or for worse. Well, whatever, for better or for worse. So definitely the same process was very different. But here's what's happening so far. As of the end of August, there have been 3,200, this is Operation Allies Welcome, that's the term, that's the kind of the process that these all are under for their referral. And there have been about 3,300 cases filed so far under that category. About half of them have been interviewed, half of them not, again, within that 45-day time period. Almost 100% granted. That, not the 37% that we're seeing for everyone else, which is great for the Afghans. They're not even getting notice of intent to deny or request for evidence, which in the immigration world is the bane of our existence. So I'm glad they're not getting them, but they're getting approved. There's only been one Afghan Operation Allies Welcome asylum case denied so far. And I'm guessing that's because they probably really have some pretty bad bars, but I don't know the details. So what does that tell you? It tells me that we believe, our country believes that these people maybe already in total in blind qualify for asylum, or maybe we aren't really evaluating these by the same expectations of others. That's why I wanted to make sure. Yeah, go ahead.
They also have better representation.
It's true, but again, if it was just like that would still only kind of take it up to with representation. It's only like 70% approval on the others. So, and I guess. I guess I shouldn't even say it's true. Here it is true, and in Wisconsin it is true. We are working very hard to make sure that all of these Afghans have representation. That's not the case nationwide. I can't speak for it all. I know that there's a large group of people who are working very hard to make it happen, but in Wisconsin, we're depending on a bunch of pro bono attorneys. Thank goodness they exist. They are making my life doable. But we have about 200 volunteer attorneys each taking one case. I know that level of organization is not happening for people. I don't know how many people are resettled in South Dakota, but I know that some people are not happy that there's some refugees in South Dakota that have to like travel to Chicago or Minneapolis to have their interviews, but that's regular refugees too. But there's resettlement agencies all over the country, and they all got Afghan asylees. And like World Relief here in the Fox Valley, they did not have an attorney on staff before this. So there is the other point though, there's a ton of money being thrown at this, which is great. But it's probably being thrown at it because they don't have a better solution, which it could be just to change the law. Yeah, did you want to say anything? It was okay, I thought so. But so you may have heard in the news this, I keep checking on this every day for me, about this thing called the Afghan Adjustment Act. This is basically a pending piece of legislation that says we have to have a better process for these people that we chose to evacuate, for these people and their families, that we literally put them on a plane. I have one client who got separated from her family in the airport, and she didn't want to leave. And the officer there, is a U.S. Military person, basically. I mean, I think he was trying to tell her the kind of thing, but he said, if you don't come with me now, your kids will only find your dead body. So they were they were fleeing. They were taking flight literally out of terrible situations. But we, the United States, decided to evacuate them. And we did that because we felt that they needed this protection. So perhaps we can either say that they are carte blanche refugees, or just give them a different option and just help them move that next step to adjustment of status. And adjustment status is the legal term for green cards. So the reason that I would argue that we need to have this is because our current limited options don't work in the context of an evacuation, where you throw 70,000 people on top of an already broken system, and the systems are already so incredibly backlogged that they're not going to be able to get through it in a reasonable period of time. And the humanitarian parole we brought people in on doesn't give them a path. We should have set a path. There's also, which is the heartbreaking part for all of our clients, they care about their immigration status. They care far more about the fact that their families are still back. And this is the case for many of our immigrants, period. But it's particularly heartbreaking when people were torn apart when they thought their life was pretty comfortable until all of a sudden it all collapsed. And this isn't something that's a new concept. After every time the United States has been in since Vietnam, we've had an adjustment act Doesn't always work great, but we at least eventually have a way to normalize the status of this large number of people instead of using what is already our broken systems to try to make it work. So what the act would do is give a permanent status, permanent green card to those who are already here, doing a lot of vetting that's already been done, a lot of background checks, and then have a better system to get the people who are left behind out. We left behind a lot of allies, like direct allies, not just family members of the people are here, but we left behind a lot of people who are in grave danger because of the fact that they worked with the United States. And this is one of my larger reasons, even though I care very deeply for my particular clients. I also think that by passing this law, we would relieve some of the pressure on the asylum system. What's happened is basically all the other asylum cases are just being pushed back farther and further. They are hiring more officers, but because of this, they aren't be able to move forward those other backlog lines. Yeah.
So you compared it to Vietnam.
Mhm.
So did they have a different process in place for Vietnam? You saying?
And they did eventually pass an adjustment act where there was a path to give a green card.
And
they
that's
did.
what you're allocating.
Yeah,
Advocating for,
yeah.
saying, let's just.
Yeah, and to have a path to this green card. And again, I mean, we all know from, many of us know from being in this area, it doesn't always go fast. So there's been at least a process to get the families back together. We did it after Vietnam, after both Iraq wars, we've done it for Cubans. So it's not a new idea. It's just.
And
yeah.
with Vietnam, like what was the approval percentage? Like right now, you're saying like only 1% has been.
I honestly couldn't tell you that. I don't know if any of the Vietnamese or any of the refugees when they came here, if they actually had to apply for asylum. I'm not sure. I think, and this is only from my broader understanding of history, not actually immigration law. I think what happened is we also kind of messed up by bringing them into the camps and evacuating those camps here in the United States and evacuating those camps so rapidly. I think what happened with Vietnam is we kept people in those camps a lot longer. I'm not saying that was the main or right way to do it either, but then it left some chances for unification that way, so that by the time they're actually admitting them into the country, they probably came in on green cards. And some people obviously still never did get those green cards, but there's different. And I would argue that the way our immigration process worked in the late 1970s versus now was better in general, just because it had at least been reformed, within the last 30 years instead of the last 70 years. But again, I'm not trying to say that was actually perfect or anything either. It's just that we've done this type of thing in the past. When we get this vast influx of one particular group, there's a way that our country can choose to deal with it. So if you do want to contact your legislators, go ahead and do that. There's lots of different advocacy groups who are pushing for this. The last I heard is that I didn't really realize that our government's possibly shutting down again in a few days. There needs to be another continuing resolution. I've heard that there may be some attempt to just slide this in there. So that is what I would love it to happen. It still would be a pain in the butt to get everybody approved, but it's better than pushing them through this broken asylum system. Now, obviously there's one very Afghan Adjustment Act is one very specific way to reform, but that does not significantly address the larger asylum issue or our larger broken immigration system issue. So I've got a whole bunch of ideas here and I can come up with even more if you'd like me to. My number one goal, it has been since, since I've been involved with this since the early 2000s, is the concept of comprehensive immigration reform, where you actually adjust our system to actually meet the needs of our country and of those people in our country, of making changes to both family-based immigration, because right now our numbers are based off of the early 1900s, where we bring in more, it's easier. The demand is not the same, and we have as many numbers allocated to Ireland as we do to Mexico, if not more. So family-based needs to be reformed. I personally believe that we should keep family-based. I think that's a very important part of our immigration system. Employment-based also isn't meeting the needs of our employers. We need a way to bring in more low-skilled workers and more high-skilled workers, and we're not meeting the needs. And many employers will tell our legislators that. I also do think that we need to have a way to make sure our humanitarian system stays humane and is not based on politics or political whims. And So basically, in general, it's saying we need to update it because we haven't updated it in a very long time to meet the demands and current immigration patterns. Where immigrants are coming to the United States now is not the same as it was 50 years ago. And that's just, yeah. Some ways you could make humanitarian-based immigration more humane. This kind of gets into talking about that stuff with the asylum, especially on the southern border. It has always happened that people who cross the border and are picked up have the ability to apply for asylum. However, it has become much more, I don't know why. I'd say there are a number of factors, but it's become more well known to those attempting to cross. It's also, we have much larger enforcement, so many people are getting picked up. But many people are crossing the border and they might be economic refugees, they might be asylees, but they are all applying for asylum. And sometimes we send them back to their home country, sometimes we send them back to Mexico, like the safe third country agreements that the Trump administration created, which most of Mexico is not safe for transient migrants. Most third countries are not safe for transient migrants, let's be very clear. So I think that we need to do some things on how we're handling the influx of immigrants from different countries. It's insane that any kind of asylum seekers have to wait 4 to 6 years. They're happy to wait because they know their odds are not in their favor. And if they get it, so that at least they get the time here. But it's not fair to put people's lives on hold the way that the United States does in many different ways. Each president has the power to control how many refugees we admit to the country. This has fluctuated greatly in the last 6 years. And that's also part of the reason that world relief is growing so much right now. There are going to be other reforms in our refugee process so that it won't all be as dependent on the resettlement agencies like World Relief. And this can all be done without passing full laws. Each president can choose this, but we want it to be so it's not as easy that it can change. And we should be accepting, it really should be based off demand, not how many things we think that we can take, because there are a ton of people waiting to have a new home. And they don't all need to see the United States, but we need to take a fair share. The other thing I would suggest for humanitarian-based immigration is that we need a permanent path for those on temporary protected status, because they've been on this temporary status, many of them for 30 years. Like it's not, our immigration system is such a mess. My final point in other kind of reform ideas is kind of, you may have heard about DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's been around for a while now. It's another executive action by President Obama, and it is still in existence. It's a little bit, it helped young immigrants who came here undocumented, and they didn't know, well, they didn't have to know, but it gave them sort of a path. It's much like humanitarian parole. It's not permanent, and it doesn't give them it doesn't give them a path to a green card. I would argue that we should give them that path to the green card, that they've earned it. Again, I don't believe people need to earn it, but a lot of people do. And there are the dreamers and the documented kids are like what people love to talk about in immigration. There's other really palatable things that people just think today, hey, you know, we should take care of this. Another one that I would suggest is like that is, there's no, us in Wisconsin, you know, the rest of the country might not care quite as much. There's no reason that temporary workers are this low-skilled working group that we have in here should not also include milk producers and dairymen, dairy farmers, because right now they don't qualify to bring in temporary workers because their work is for everything but temporary, because since you have to milk cows like 2 or 3 times a day, every day, and all that stuff. So there are a lot of piecemeal and palatable options that I'd advocate for all of them, but I would argue that if there's any chance of reform, it's going to be first by this piecemeal thing. And I would also argue that putting the Afghan Adjustment Act through would be an incredible small sign to say, hey, we actually, both parties recognize that there is an interest in this in our country and that we want to do the right thing. We want to not only help immigrants, but we also want to meet the needs of our citizens, and different citizens have different interests. But for the Afghan Adjustment Act, it's our veterans who are screaming that we need to help those who helped us and those who saved their lives. But there are other groups, obviously, for each of these areas, people like yourselves who advocate for changes in the piecemeal or maybe for everything. So that's my crazy spiel for way too long and so much detail. That's what happens when you guys get a chance to talk. I will go into lots of detail, but what else do you want to talk about? Yeah, sorry.
I'm just curious, do you have any, your bullet points eliminate, remain Mexico safe third party, third country agreements?
Mhm.
What do you visualize as like a solution?
So I think part of the stress that has been put on the asylum system is because we failed to come up with a better full immigration system. I don't think it's appropriate. And unfortunately, I don't believe that many of the people who are crossing the border on our southern border, they are not going to get asylum. I think I mean, I can make an argument for anybody to get asylum, but they are fleeing for economic reasons. They may be fleeing because of generalized violence. I hope to God most of them have not had what gets to the point that they would qualify for asylum. So I would say that if you eliminate these things, the remain in Mexico, well, what everyone says who's against them is that will cause an influx of immigration. And I would argue if you change the whole system, perhaps you wouldn't have that influx. And I also, again, this is my own personal bias, I would argue that our country can take more people and it would be much better if they were actually, if we could actually keep track of them. I mean, like, it drives me crazy that many of my clients can't get a license or can't get a identity card. Like, we have no way of keeping track of people, and they're scared to get help when they need it. They're scared to call the police when they need it, and the police would rather be able to just say they don't want to worry about people not talking to them because they're scared they're going to get deported. So I mean, I think our country has literally has a lot of space, but has a lot of space in employment. And even in the social services area that we could help more people. So but I realize I'm on the fringe on that. that in believing that we could safely have a better regulated, larger immigration system. But I would say just the safe third party specifically and remain in Mexico is a problem because Mexico is a hot mess. Like, Mexicans are not in general going to get asylum in the United States either, but the gang violence that's happening in Mexico, especially when people are just pushed back barely over the border, it's awful. It is not safe. It is not a safe, just objectively, it is not a safe third country. And honestly, like, that's even the struggle, like, you can look at it in just about any country where there is this kind of issue. Like, so you look at Afghanistan, and safe third country would be Iran and Pakistan. Look what's happening in Iran right now. That's where Afghans are fleeing to. Like, and that happens basically anywhere where there's these areas of unrest, and it's happening in Africa in various places. And it's just a hard situation. So safe third country, I get it. If you really could go to Belgium and get citizenship, you should go there. But I don't, yeah, but I don't think it's safe to say just because you pass through that country, that means that you need to stay there, because they're usually a mess too.
I'm curious, something that you mentioned that I've been thinking about with the employers that like that change, because I'm watching like general concerns with immigration over the past few decades, the job issue. In the last couple of years, nobody can hire enough anymore. Is that going to be helpful? Do you think that's actually pushing the time?
So that's part of the reason I bring up the Afghan Adjustment Act, why I bring up the fact that veterans are the biggest allies in fighting for this. Likewise, the employers of various types of employers are going to be the most powerful fighting for this kind of change, because it's the idea of strange bedfellows and unlikely allies. They need more workers, and I mean, so for instance, like, I think, like, they want to do it the right way is the other struggle. Like, it's not fun for any employer to employ undocumented people. It's scary. They could get in big trouble. But many of them do it because they have no other choice. I don't know how they do it. I choose not to try to find out. But that was part of my work I did with the BRCA back in the day. I think that that is the most powerful voice. And I mean, there have been times, and when we were closest to comprehensive immigration reform was under second Bush administration, the Chamber of Commerce is in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. Like employers are the ones who are going to be able to say, look, our economy needs these workers and we can't fill these jobs with US workers. It's not always with the dairy farmers. They need, I mean, I think World Relief has struggled with influx of refugees, period, to get housing and various other things. They were able to give them all jobs at large employers in the area because they were factories that needed a lot of workers. So that that's going to be, and it's just the question is if they have the political will and if they can. And I do think they have the will, and I think that they have been pushing for it. And there are some really heroic dairy farmers here in Wisconsin that have been making a big difference, especially over in the Manitowoc area. But that because they can get the ear of different legislators than bleeding hearts like me. So that's why I will not necessarily be the best. Well, I'll be the best advocate, but I will not be the most effective advocate sometimes. But yes, employers will make a huge difference, and I think the more we can support them in encouraging their contacts and those who they influence, will make a big difference.
I think changing public issue perception as well.
Yeah.
They're embracing it and saying, this is how we keep your jobs here,
Right.
bringing these people in.
Yeah, exactly. And this is how we don't have to move our factories somewhere else. This is how, and I'm curious because it's happening nationwide. In any issue, when you actually experience it, people can empathize better. And I think a way that many people who would consider themselves kind of anti-immigrant or not really in favor of immigration reform, if they end up working with a person, like it helps change minds a little bit and people can understand a little bit more. And that's one great way, even without directly working with the employers. But yeah, I think employers are really huge, and I think more the Chamber of Commerce and those kind of lobbying groups can make a huge difference. Yeah.
I'm just curious how you said that the town that's so short for the
Mm-hmm.
So then what's the court system like? Is it totally overwhelmed? Or were they able to squeeze into those communities? Do these people have to actually go into the courtroom?
So the Afghans are all on the affirmative asylum side of things. So they are not yet in removal proceedings. So they have to go to the the asylum office in Chicago. They don't have to, unless they get denied, they don't actually have to go to court. Once you're in court, that's when you're on the defensive side of things. That being said, there's 460,000 affirmative cases pending right now. So yeah, it caused a crunch. But also how I mentioned the way the government is dealing with this is by throwing money at it. They are hiring a lot of new asylum officers. They are moving asylum officers away from other cases. They were trying to hire new asylum officers, but again, there's not enough employees. So they have to go down to their, and that's within the discretion of the executive branch. They can kind of say we were prioritizing these cases, and so that's what Biden did to address it. But still, it impacts everybody. There's also, even by doing this, like the fact that they're saying, oh, you'll get an interview within 45 days. When they get these 30,000 cases, there's no way they're going to be able to do them in 45 days. It's just impossible. So it'll be interesting to see. We're headed for a very big collision course in my world, but it'll be interesting to observe it.
If the adjustment act passes, what happens for the waiver of the actions for immigrants?
And so last I heard, the way that the bill is written is you would have to wait for, and basically at the end of them getting this 2 years of humanitarian parole, they would get their green cards without having to do like asylum or so they'd have to fill out a form, don't get me wrong, there's still going to be paperwork because of course, but what happens from what I understand is those people who have already been granted they'll still probably be on a faster path. They would just probably get converted over, and I would assume they would be at the front of the line. So for those who have already been granted asylum, there are some people who are Afghans who will be, like, again, there's not that many that have been granted so far, but 1 year after that is when they should apply for their green card. By the way, this little wave, this push of the 70,000 people, yeah, it's impacting asylum right now, but remember, again, in 1 to 3 years, they're all applying for their green cards too. So there's an equivalent backlog for the green card process. That's just gonna cause this weird, awful, annoying ripple effect for the whole immigration world, but we can figure that out.
Another question.
Yeah.
Just to clarify something so at the beginning, so if somebody non-Afghan file makes an asylum claim, they can get employment authorization and unrestricted social while they're waiting for a decision.
They can for sure get their work permit.
Okay.
I don't know for sure if it's non-restricted social.
Okay.
I think it is, but I'm not positive. Just so for some of you who probably are not as working as much in the social security and immigration world, when people come in and have get their social security number, it could say things like, so many people are eligible for a social security number who don't have authorization to work. So their card may say valid only, well, I don't know the right terminology, but basically valid based off of immigration status. So for those people, when they're applying for jobs, they have to show that they still have that immigration status so they can work. So like when you get that social security card that doesn't have that limitation on there, it's a game changer. It's much easier to get different kinds of jobs just because of the paperwork. It's just, I mean, it's the same type of things you have to submit, but it's one of those really good steps that, really good question on James. I'm not sure what happens with those cards. I know they can apply for a social security card though.
So once you're in, like applying for asylum and you're kind of in that 46-year window, do you have to continuously check in, or are you just kind of like out there? Or
You're generally out there. You have to always keep, and tell this to any immigrant you work with, keep your address current with the immigration system, because that's a good way to just lose all immigration if you don't change your time. You're supposed to do it within 10 days by law, anytime you move. Yeah, so you're kind of in the system unless you are in removal proceedings. So remember, a lot of these people do this as a defense to getting deported. And that system is also backed up for a very long time. And it's backed up partially because these people all deserve a hearing. Then likely people who are in removal proceedings do have to check in 6 months or a year, but they are not deportable until the decision is made. They are not actually able to be removed from the country until their asylum claim is denied. But I mean, that's taken us down a whole other path. So some people who don't have asylum claims, you know, even if some people have been ordered removed or in removal proceedings, that's removal is the word that we used in the last 10 years to replace the word deport. So it's I guess it is the legal term, but it's also the politically correct term, but it's also not nearly as emotional. So I often will use the term deport somebody because that's what we're doing. We're removing them, but they're also being deported. And so those people may not immediately get kicked out of the country either. It sometimes takes a really long time for that to happen. Or conversely, they could just get picked up and be gone the next day. It's kind of crazy how that goes. So should we talk through, well, so I don't know, do any of you have, I'm guessing you were working with people who could potentially be asylum seekers. I know of a lot, like we were planning to have kind of testimonial for tonight of people. I don't know if you want to go into that or should I kind of talk to what you do.
I'll talk a little bit. You
Yep.
already some of the things and been better lacking. I'm trying to talk about whether to see how well our staff is supposed to be here today. She was gonna, I'm not gonna tell her stories. She's a recent immigrant, who's a former student of ours. She's employed by us. So, and this is a brief example of like one of the students at the informal league we have at the TPS. We've worked with, and he recently was interviewed on Spectrum News, I believe. And this will take you to the story if you're not a Spectrum person. But just that he's very honest. I mean, I knew it and reading it was a very powerful story. It was really brave, helpful of him to be able to put that out there so openly. And we've used this and we're trying to actually do a little bit more of advocacy on our side. We did some tabling at Lawrence for everything, and we've actually been bringing letters because we don't traditionally do that, and I think that's something that nonprofits, they can't advocate, we can do a certain amount, and this is a place where we should be. So we actually do have some letters for your representative if you want to send them. We have stamps and envelopes as well. Because that does, will it be the thing that tips the tide? No, but it doesn't hurt either. It does help. And anything that we can do to show support and to help get the diverse voices heard, be it the Bleeding Hearts or, you know, the corporate manager who just really needs to fill his assignment. Those are all, anything that helps make the case for why these people belong here and deserve our support. Take whatever route it takes sometimes. I'm just trying to, I'm just struggling to do a nice bit too, just because we've really covered a lot of what we talked about. But for those of us who are acting with approximately literacy have done or doing tutoring, this is something that we could bring to your session that you could talk to students about. As always, we don't ask about specifically how are people here, what their documentation is, but it's a conversation about representation, civic engagement. We have a lot of people who they're so excited to vote, so excited to be able to connect and be a part of the community, figuring out what civic engagement looks like to them, and then figuring out how they can fit into that here is another way to make it to be home here. We can do that. Because if you know that they are supposed to listen to, that your voice doesn't matter to make this impact on how small it is, yeah, that goes ways when there's not a lot of other options. Yeah, I'm not going to be as moving as Thomas, so I'm just going to keep it fast. But we do have the letters, and I'm going to be happy to talk about that are signed. You can have personal anecdotes. Bring them home, bring some friends, you have students, like you said, please, and all you can ask us questions.
Is that included with, is this, direction series questions?
Yes. So yeah, the letters, we have like these letters here that we want to edit something with envelopes, stamps and everything. That reads.
I would also just add that in my experience in advocacy, the letters matter, probably more so than the emails that I help you to do. I don't know why, but phone calls also really matter. So if you really, and I hate talking on the phone.
Yeah.
So I generally will not do the phone calls, but because that will get the personal attention of whoever's in the office.
They track, I work with more advocacy-based organizations in the past, they track that. The emails, the petitions are great, but they understand that that's a couple of things. You sign something, drop it in the mail, it's formatted. Oh, this was actual human time, not somebody who just, hey, that I put on Facebook. It's the same thing for the phone calls. Like those things they track different than how many emails they got. These are more likely to move the needle.
And the only thing I would also add, I've had a couple of clients or people who are also helping, like, so they're sometimes the clients are interested in trying to advocate for themselves as well. Obviously, none of us are in a position to pressure them to do that, but I'm totally willing to always give them the contact information if they want to. Like I said, you can take it to your appointments with them and help explain. And those voices really, I think, do matter too, because I think that's also that idea of helping people have empathy once you actually are exposed to that, you know, if they actually meet ones or whoever, that it matters. And telling those stories in whatever you do in your comments as well matters. And this is what you can take to the tutoring section. That was the last slide.
Yes. So. Any last questions from me? Thank you.
I love doing it. I love talking about this. But yeah, so let me know. Feel free to ask me another person separately or email me or call me or whatever. I love talking about this. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
And thank you, by the way, too.
Yeah.